At the beginning of the war, my mother buried her laughter. Streamers hang motionless in the kitchen doorway. Just outside their brightness flies a buzz. Inside, my mother peels potatoes. Her silence cuts my skin. She drops the discards on a newspaper spread out on the table. My mother is a Greek sculpture. Only her hands move. She picks up another tuber, turns it around, says, "In the war, we didn't throw away anything." Her knife scrapes the sandy spot, a grating sound, like the scratching of squirrels in winter, paws searching the frozen earth.
You've been listening to Atma Frans reading her poem, At the Beginning of the War. This is Writers Radio. I'm Ingrid Rose, your host for our program, A Belgian Childhood, Poems by Atma Frans. My guest has many personas, but as a poet, her words take us, both reader and listener, beneath surface identities, into a space that lets memory reform in the present. You started your career as an architect.
Mm-hmm.
So that's been quite a big part of your life, being an architect.
Right.
Right. And then because of vertigo or some tell me just a little bit about that.
7 or 8 years ago, I developed Meniere's disease, which can cause very sudden dizzy spells, and it also impacts overall balance. And so, as an architect, you walk around on construction sites, which are open and can be quite dangerous if you suddenly would lose your balance. So, I realized at that point that it would not be a good idea to continue this career long term. And so, but I first reschooled as an expressive arts therapist before I became a poet. And I actually was working as an expressive arts therapist into the first months of the pandemic. And then I decided to take creative time for myself, because also during the pandemic, you could not spend much money anyway. So I decided I could live on a lower income and nurture my creativity. And then there was this burst of poetry that came out of me, and I've been continuing to actually write since then.
So is there in your mind maybe, or a sense of this, a connection between the architect in you and the poet?
There's actually two sides to the answer. The first is that I am a creative person, and it's something I noticed my whole life, that I always making something or creating something. And like at some point when I was raising children, I wasn't working as an architect, and then I found myself developing new recipes, like combining new flavors. So I realized that there's this urge in myself to create, to make something from nothing, to make something new from what's around me. So that's one part of the answer to how architecture and poetry relate, is that my whole life I've been creating things. The other part is that I have brought a lot of, actually Betsy Warland, who was my first mentor and teacher when I started my path as poetry, she asked me the question. She asked me she mentioned, Betsy said, you never start from nothing. Like you can always use whatever you've learned in other fields and bring it into poetry. And so she made me reflect on what it was that I already knew about composition from my work as an architect. And so I could kind of consciously use those principles, like principles of contrast, for example. When you put two things together that are different, they both become bigger and more, they both stand out more. It's a bit like when you use darkness and light together, they both become more pronounced. And then, of course, movement. Like as an architect, when I design, I did mostly residential architecture. And so I always thought a lot about movement, how and transition, like how one moves from an outdoor space into an indoor space, and how to detail and create that threshold from one to the other, and also how one would move through a house, and also the private spaces and public spaces within the house, and also from the house to the outside. And I think all of those ideas do come back when I'm writing poetry. It's the same concerns, basically.
Atma now reads What is Remembered.
I often sneaked up to Grandma's apartment on the upper floor of our house to watch the telly on her red faux fur couch, my body leaning into her warmth. Always reruns of black and white movies of the 40s and 50s. She would advise the heroine, "Don't trust him, he's a crook." Or in Casablanca, "He still loves you, don't you see?" She must have known the endings though, having watched them on the big screen. Her husband's arm around her shoulder, the Spanish flu, the wars, the ration coupons over, all worries seemingly behind them. Grandpa's picture hung above our dining room table. A tall man, raven black hair like my mother, an unlit cigarette between his fingers. Once I asked Mom for a dog. "No," she said. "It's too sad when he dies." Outside, my partner walks down the garden path, and I remember last night's dream. A bullet pierced my chest. Half awake, my fingers leapt to my heart, searching for the sticky warmth of a wound. How vulnerable love makes us. At the gate, my partner turns and waves. "We'll always have Paris," Humphrey Bogart said, and let the heroine walk away to safety. I thought Grandma would say, "Don't go, turn around, love is precious." But she just squeezed my hand.
That was Atma Frans reading her poem, What is Remembered?
But I do think about a poem as a whole, as a space that holds something, and that also holds the reader. So you can actually talk about material that's quite sensitive if you create a poem as a container that can hold the reader and the material, and I guess the poet too. So in that sense, I feel more that a poem is like a house because it has a capacity of holding the inhabitants. And with a poem, I guess it's only a few minutes that you're being held as a reader, but it's still that same experience of you enter it. There always has to be a door into the poem. And I think just like with a house, like you kind of make your first impressions when you arrive, like this is a safe place, this is a welcoming place. And I think with a poem too, the first lines, you try to bring the reader in and kind of give them that confidence. Yes, I know you'll be in good hands. the rest of the poem so that the reader can surrender to the words. Short-haired and flat-chested, Crystal and I are ignored by the girls with bleached hair, the boys who pull up in their car windows down. Come on, baby, do the locomotion, blaring from the speakers. And we ignore them, avoid the bungalow park. Instead, we clean the stable at an old farm, ride bareback on a Belgian draft, Crystal's fingers in his mane, my arms around her waist, his broad back rocking us, his tail whipping at droning flies. On our left, pines in shade, we duck our heads, needles sweep against our arms. As if he remembers his ancestry of carrying knives through woods, he speeds into a trot, legs thrashing through ferns and brambles. We grip him with our thighs and knees, fear and laughter in our chest. Oh, oh, we shout, but he canters on, through the forest, back onto the road, doesn't slow, till he reaches the gate of his own meadow. With rags we dry his sweaty flank. On our open palms we offer grasses. His lips soft on our skin, his teeth shredding away the minutes. Soon I'll be driven home, father at the steering wheel, mother poised in front, her mannequin hands folded in her lap.
You've just heard Atma Frans reading her poem, Bareback on a Brabant Horse. Atma, you've been here in Canada over 30 years, but you originally come from Belgium, the Flemish-speaking part. What I noticed when I lived there about the Flemish was a certain humbleness.
That's correct. I think Flemish people are quite humble, and I've wondered if that's related to the fact that we've been under occupation for 2,000 years. Like, it started with the Romans, and then every country in Europe has occupied us. The Austrians, the Germans, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch. We only have been independent for about 150 years, and even then, up until the Second World War, it was the French upper class that ruled Belgium. So the Flemish felt very much like the underdogs. So I think part of that humility comes from circumstances, and but at the same time, there's also an exuberance in the culture and joie de vivre and fondness of life and wanting to embrace the moment and good food, for example. Your mother and you, in Italian sandals, lean against the railing of a pleasure boat. The boat carves a tail of foam as it leaves the white hotel pilasters, pots with orange blossoms, the dog you played with. Your mother's dress swishes around bare legs, the smell of lake water, on her wrist a whiff of Skszwx de Paris. Wind lifts her head, the black camera in your father's hands captures her laughter. A few years later, you, a hippie teen, run barefoot, while her feet now hide in nylons. Her toes, so beautiful in sandals, squeezed together beneath brown gauze. You still catch glimpses of your mother's elegance as she arranges tulips in a crystal vase, the tall stems yielding in her tender hands, her face undone by beauty. Now older than your mother, that afternoon on the lake, you gaze with surprise at her glamour. You remember Skszwx de Paris kept in azure glass at her bedside table, the dog you chased between pots of orange blossoms, the pleasure boat, and her laughter as the wind caught her head. But you do not remember the shadow in her eyes, fear of the camera, retreat beneath her skin, nor how the wind whipped your hair as you leaned across the railing, away from her, towards the world.
That was Atma Frans reading her poem, Italian Sandals. Atma, because of Belgians' history of being occupied for hundreds of years, would you say that people have developed a tremendous resilience?
But I think that's also part of Flemish nature. When you say that, I immediately have to think of Bruegel's painting Icarus, where you see the Icarus plunging in the water, and then in the front there is the farmer who's plowing. And we actually have an expression that says the farmer will plow on. So this idea of whatever happens in the world, the common man will just keep doing what they have been doing all along and try to find a way through.
Do you feel that that's a quality that is in your writing? In spite of the terrible eco damage, there's still places of beauty, there's still things that create joy in us.
It's an interesting question, because I think in my writing, I've definitely been trying to connect with resilience and joy and hope and express that. And I think a lot of my life has been about surviving trauma and surviving generational trauma, and at the same time experience happiness and joy in connection with nature. From when I was a very small child, that has always been a very nurturing factor in my life. At the same time, I do feel desperate about the disappearance of biodiversity in forests and the state of the world, and it feels like we're a bit blind to and unconscious about what's actually happening.
Atma Frans, let's hear a final poem that takes us back with you to your early experience of nature.
We wade into a ditch, murky water pushing against our valleys. We hold empty jam jars in hopes of treasure, dragonflies, rocks, and giant spiders. This is our cousin's paradise, these fallow fields where tall grasses wave feathery heads and earth smells of rot and decay. A frog fills its cheeks. Its damp body squirms between my hands. One foot wriggles out between my fingers, reaches for the reeds, the marshy water. We marvel at its orange belly, bumpy green coat, its fingers splayed against the glass. We walk on through thistles, dandelions, poppies, and the flowery spikes of plantain. The wind carries an acrid smell. We look over our shoulders at a thin plume of smoke. It's just a landfill, our cousin says. It catches fire all the time. He leads us to a bunker surrounded by white wild roses, stinging nettles. We're not allowed to play here. This belongs to the war the adults don't speak of. We circle it, find an opening in the thorny hedge, hesitate before the gaping hole, groggy edges. Inside, smell of pea and mold. Light filters grey through narrow slits, green algae streak the walls. A scattering of black mold covers names scratched in the concrete, a penis in orange paint. On the floor, cigarette butts and rusty shrapnel. Nothing more. Cold seeps into our skin. We can't hear the croaks of frogs, nor how the rain hammers the muddy land. We run outside and shake our arms, let our laughter ride on the wet wind. At the last reeds I squat, tilt the jar, watch the bright belly, bumpy green coat, leap away on long, slender legs.
That was Atma Frans reading her poem, We're Not Allowed to Play Here. You've been listening to Writers Radio. I'm Ingrid Rose, your host for this program, A Belgian Childhood, poems by Atma Frans. My appreciation to my co-producers and hosts, Carol Harmon and Gary Sill, and our gratitude for the original music and technical skills of Gary Sill. Also, a big thank you to you, our listeners.
You have been listening to Writers Radio, a non-commercial collaborative project which presents talented writers reading their own work. These stories, essays, and conversations revisit the long tradition of oral storytelling that connects us to the inspiration behind the words. Be sure to check the website, writersradio.ca, to subscribe to our free notifications list. It's also a way of letting the writers know you are there and appreciating their creative work.
Writers Radio broadcasts from Half Moon Bay on the Sunshine Coast in Canada, traditional tribal land of the Skszell Nation of the Coast Salish peoples. We express our gratitude for their wisdom teachings and land stewardship.